Hello model citizens! Yo, in this video you're going to learn how to disassemble your airbrush for a full clean back to factory fresh and how to improve it slightly before reassembly. Let's go! Now I've been really good and I've been washing out my airbrush between colours. Washing out my airbrush between colours with a good airbrush cleaner is the best way to make sure that dried paint doesn't interrupt a smooth finish. And now I've come back to paint and I've realised that I didn't wash out my airbrush at the most important time, the end of the day. Now it's a couple of days later and this paint is totally dry. The mild airbrush cleaner that I've been using to this point won't take care of this, at least not without soaking for a couple of hours. So I'm going to use something a bit stronger. This spray airbrush cleaner is very fast acting and actually quite toxic, so it's better to wear a mask when using this one. Now the paint in this airbrush has probably been drying for about 72 hours, so it's really caked on. I imagine this could be a daunting prospect to clean, but don't worry, this will take no time at all. There's nothing in this process that could damage the airbrush, so there's nothing to worry about. It's just a matter of getting down and getting on with it. Now I'm going to have to take this apart completely to clean it properly. Because I've been blowing air back through the nozzle to mix paint in the cup, paint has started to work its way back through the airbrush body and up onto the exposed part of the needle in the airbrush shaft. This isn't an expensive airbrush, but it is a pretty good one. So instead of just taking it back to factory fresh, I'm going to try and take it one step further. The first thing to do is to remove the dry paint from the cup. A quick squirt of the airbrush cleaner will start to loosen that paint and turn it back into liquid. Perfect. I can clean it out with a cotton bud, and I don't really want to use a paintbrush because sticking a clean paintbrush into that mess is just another set of cleaning. Having taken out most of the paint, I can clean around the inside of the cup just like I normally would with a little bit of tissue paper. Tissue paper and cotton buds are fine for this purpose, as long as they don't leave fluff inside the cup that could get stuck inside the airbrush. At this point I can rinse out the cup with some plain water and see how much work is left to do. Perfect. Once I've got most of the paint out, I go back in with another spray of the airbrush cleaner to get out the remaining paint. At this point, most of the paint will be removed from the cup, and it'll be a lot easier to disassemble the airbrush and get to the paint in all of the remaining areas. The first part to remove is the needle cap. The second part to remove is the nozzle cap. I've got a lot of hidden paint build up on the needle. At this point the needle would love to stab into your finger, so please be careful. The rest of the airbrush parts are all disassembled from the rear. First the main needle cover. Next is the needle chucking nut that keeps the needle locked in place. Next the spring case that keeps the spring locked in place. Then the spring and the needle chucking guide, which keep the needle straight and give you some tension to pull back on the trigger with. Now the only thing left for me to do is to remove the needle. But as you can see, I don't really want to pull the needle back through my airbrush and introduce all of that paint into the inside of my airbrush body. So I'm going to push the needle forwards and take it out through the front. At this point, the airbrush is fully disassembled for cleaning, apart from the trigger and the trigger guard. The first thing I check is the air hole at the front of the airbrush. As long as everything's been sealed properly, it's unlikely there'll be a problem here, but I'll take a look. The air travelling out of the small hole at the bottom creates a vacuum along the length of the needle, which sucks the paint along the needle with the air. Once I've taken out the trigger and the trigger guard, this is ready for the final cleaning. I put a few of the parts into a bowl of the mild airbrush cleaner while I get on with cleaning the most important parts. Firstly, the needle. With the airbrush relying on air being able to suck paint along the needle, having dried paint or any kind of bumps on the needle make that process a lot less smooth. I spray some airbrush cleaner onto a piece of tissue and simply wipe it off. Now the two main things to pay attention to here are not to squeeze the needle and inadvertently bend it, and to go up the needle, come back down and come back down into your finger. This is a needle after all. The paint should come off really easily. If it's not coming off, you probably just need a little more airbrush cleaner. Now as I'm cleaning this, I've noticed that the tip of my needle is actually bent. Now I noticed that my airbrush seemed to be spraying an inch to the left, an inch down, something like that, and I could affect that by rotating the needle, so I kind of knew the needle was bent. But this is the perfect time, as I've got my airbrush taken apart, to replace this needle with a better needle. I won't throw this one away however, so I'll give it some quick maintenance with some 800 grit sandpaper just to make sure it's perfectly smooth. Back to cleaning the rest of the parts, it really is just a case of spray with some airbrush cleaner, wipe off. Spray with some airbrush cleaner, wipe that off too. Maybe a toothpick and pick in between some of the finer areas, but spray with some airbrush cleaner and clean off. The little spanner in your airbrush kit is for removing the nozzle. Once the nozzle's been removed, the nozzle cap can be soaked in the airbrush cleaner just like any other part and can be easily cleaned with a toothpick. The airbrush cleaner is very slippery. It does make the task more difficult, but not that difficult. I'm literally wiping something with a tissue. The paint that had worked itself up the inside of the airbrush was a little more difficult to get out. I used a combination of a toothpick, a cotton bud and my bent needle to work out all of the paint. The mild airbrush cleaner turned the paint into a kind of gum, which made it a lot easier to get it out. Once I caught the corner of it, I could just scoop it out. With all of the visible paint removed from all of the parts, I give it one last wash in the mild airbrush cleaner using a toothbrush. Using a toothpick in the needle hole will get out the last bits of paint in there. If you haven't bought a specific airbrush cleaning set, a toothpick is probably the best cleaning tool at this stage. Next I'm going to pass the needle through the whole length of the airbrush, and that again reveals more paint being dislodged. You can see the size of the chunks. I do this one more time and the inside of the airbrush is clean. Now it's almost time to reassemble, so about that needle replacement. You should be able to see the bent tip, but what you definitely will be able to see is the shape of these needles. The needle that I'm taking out has a triangular kind of top. It's got a kind of ridge, and I'm sure that that ridge interferes with the smooth flow of paint. So I'm going to switch it out for this more contoured needle. Time to rinse off all the parts in water, and apart from the needle, another quick improvement. I leave all the parts to air dry and then reassemble the airbrush. First I replace the nozzle cap. Then I replace the trigger and the trigger guard. The trigger guard is probably the only complicated part of the airbrush. It needs to go a certain way around. It needs to curve on my airbrush away from the trigger. Once you've done this 1 or 2 times, however, it will be simple. Next come the needle chucking guide and the spring, along with the next improvement. Instead of replacing the spring as it was before, I'm putting in 2 springs. This will increase the tension as I pull back on the trigger, making it a lot easier to do smaller adjustments. I lock the 2 springs down with the same spring case. Next I replace the nozzle. Again I'm using the supplied spanner, but I'm only tightening it finger tight. This nozzle can snap off, leaving the thread stuck inside your airbrush. Next is the new needle, and then it's the needle locking nut. The new sensitive trigger is a great improvement. I can tell much easier how far I've pulled the trigger back, as there's so much more resistance. I'm replacing this washer in the wrong place, but that will reveal itself as soon as I go to use my airbrush again. At the moment I'm just really happy with this new trigger. Don't forget to replace your needle cover, as this will stop your needle tip bending. Now I spray through some water just to see what's happening. There's a few paint remnants been blown through, but unfortunately I've got spider webbing and I've got bubbling coming out the side of the airbrush. Now both of those things, as I'm spraying airbrush cleaner, will suggest that I've got an air leak in my airbrush. So I'm going to remove that rubber O-ring and just go on without it. And as you can see now, I'm getting a smooth, super fine mist, just like I wanted. I could put the O-ring back where it's supposed to be, but you know what? I think I'm just going to leave it out. So on goes my needle cover, and I'm back to business. Just to show how fast acting this airbrush cleaner is, we'll give this a once over as well. Now this paint's been on there a bit longer than a couple of days. So there it is. 10-15 minutes work and just about any airbrush can be brought back to life. And with the replacement of a needle and a couple of springs, maybe improved a bit too. don't give up on that airbrush, just clean it out. If you liked this quick tutorial and you can make use of these tips videos, leave a like and subscribe. Hit me up in the comments below.